Hey guys, what's up? This is Christina Riley with Studiobeanhead, and you're listening to and watching the Caffeinated Inspiration podcast. Today I'm here with Marty Michelson, and he is currently in Oregon, in his hometown, so that's kind of cool. He is both a pastor and an educator and holds a doctorate in ancient Jewish history and literature. You can check his online handle out at martymichelson.com to learn more. So today we're going to talk about shalom, which is the Hebrew word for peace. As I said before, Marty has a doctorate in ancient Jewish history and literature, so his perspective is extremely unique and extremely valuable. So I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about today, and especially getting to hear his perspective on shalom, peace. But before we get started, really quickly, how's the weather where you're at right now?
So I love Oregon weather. Some people who aren't from Oregon, criticize it. When it rains in Oregon, I don't live here anymore right now. But when I was born and raised here, the phrase is that it's Oregon sunshine when it's raining.
I've never been to Oregon, so I don't.
Yeah. And another thing about Oregon that I try to dispel the myth for people is people will say, well, doesn't it rain there all the time? And it's a little more accurate to say it rains most days, not every day, but then it never dries up. So what happens is it'll rain one day and then just the sun doesn't come out. It only rained for 2 hours, but the sun doesn't come out for 3 days. So everything is still wet 3 days later. So the perception, it's really, I think it's a better representation of Oregon to say that it's wet here all the time and it rains, infrequently, and the sun doesn't come out enough to dry it. So that's probably a better representation.
That's cool. So what's your drink of the day?
So I am not a hot drink beverage drinker. So I am drinking the root beer this evening.
Ooh, root beer.
Yeah, I prefer A&W brand, if that makes any difference.
Yep, that's okay.
I thought about having it in like the frosty mug, but then I thought that might look a little too frosty mug.
Yeah.
So.
Well, today I am drinking a really good lavender chamomile with probiotics added to it. So it's
there you go. All right.
Good for you. You're being bad.
I am. So I will tell you, if it weren't for the time of day, I would have Mountain Dew in it. I tell students.
You're gonna have Mountain Dew. I was waiting for the.
Yeah, I say Mountain Dew is my poison of choice.
So, Marty, do you have any insight that you could share with us about peace, and specifically in the relationship of the Hebrew word for shalom and how it relates to us today?
I definitely do. Obviously, as you've shared, the word shalom generally means peace or wholeness, well-being. Could be an interpretation and translation for it. One thing unique about the language of what we call biblical Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, is that the vocabulary was actually much smaller than the vocabulary we have today. So obviously you're not going to find words in ancient languages for all of the things that you would find in an engine or on an airplane, because those things didn't exist. So words and the vocabulary was smaller, but that also meant that the way words were constructed was different. And without getting into all of that, what that means is that Hebrew is constructed upon roots, and it's the sort of abbreviated forms of words that expand and mean other things. So the root of the word, the SHLM sound, the shalom, actually then in Hebrew is constructed to mean other kinds of things. So since the Hebrew has this root form that then gets expanded in these different ways, what that means is that SHLM sound, that shalom, really can mean lots of things. And it can mean to cause peace, to bring about peace. It even has a kind of a forcefulness of to force the peace upon someone, which is really extending goodness toward them. So shalom, in its ancient Hebrew understanding and the biblical worldview, can mean lots of things about goodness, wholeness, wellness, well-being, and sort of structured communities of wholeness and well-being.
So you're an educator with master's degrees in counseling and a certificate in conflict negotiation and peacemaking. How do you educate persons for peace?
Oh man, that's such a great question. Let me step back from that for just a minute. Let me just talk about training anybody for anything, which is obviously a form of education. But let me step into some sort of tangible worlds where we train people with our bodies. So let's go to the idea of, say, someone taking up any form of martial arts, karate, for example. If you want to train someone in martial arts and karate, You take them into a dojo or wherever room you're going to be in, and you walk them physically through the motions of how to engage in karate. And of course, that's going to involve hand motions and leg kicks, and there's going to be certain postures to it. But the reason I start with that, I'll give another example, is that it's a training process that begins with limited motions and then expands on that. And then obviously the extent of one's range, how long they can, wide they can spread out their legs, is built on, of course, their stretching and over time. The strength of a punch is, of course, built on muscle strength, but also practicing exactly how to apply the punch. So there's training involved with that. And I don't care if you start training in martial arts as a 5-year-old or a 50-year-old. You start and you train and increasingly get better. The same thing is going to be true for anything you train for, and in education, whether you're studying an ancient language, learning American or European literature, whatever it is. But I'll go with the piano. You could have the most. There are some people that are what we call child prodigies, that people that are just exceptionally gifted with, say, music in this category, and that person, male or female, is going to be more attuned to and mentally able to know how to use the chords and the sounds out of a piano to play something magisterial. But they themselves cannot actually play it with the sort of virtuoso, with the kind of high level of expertise that's needed, until literally they are trained so their fingers can move up and down the keyboard. So you could have someone, hypothetically, that can understand and read music at a high level, but if their fingers, that is, the muscles in their fingers, can't actually keep up with the actions, then they are not the grand pianist that they could be. So back to your question about training someone and training people for peace, I think those same categories apply for almost everything that we do in education. That is, we train for it. We start people off with no or little skill, and we give them practices. We give them habits. We give them ways of being in the world that help them develop with these kinds of things. So, I mean, there's so many examples, and I feel like I'm talking quite a bit here, but let me just real quick say, sort of picking up on this karate, martial arts, or piano, if you want people to live peaceably one with another, then you have to train them with the most basic skills in life that work toward larger, more scales of peace and wellness and well-being. I just happened to come from a dinner with a former student of mine. He's got a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old. And at several times in the meal and when I was with them, the children were encouraged, say thank you, say please. That's a habit that trains people in peaceableness. Now, it might not seem like that because we think about peace of ending of war or mass scale conflicts. But quite frankly, unless you have people who can sit down and talk kindly one to another and not get angry in disproportionate ways, again, a skill that people learn, a trained habit, unless you get people who can talk to people reasonably, you cannot then forfend what might eventually become a war. Obviously, there's lots of complexity between training and please and thank you in a war. But again, my simple way of trying to answer your question, probably not too simple, I wax too eloquent, is that we train. We train people in how to be peacemakers. We train people in better ways to communicate. We train people in listening well. We train people in responding well. We train people in understanding misperception, miscommunication, misplaced anger, and ways to be more loving and compassionate and understand the sort of posture and being that other people bring to the space of being humans together.
So one thing that kind of comes to mind as you're talking specifically about misconceptions of peace, I think a lot of people think that peace is like a feeling, and when that feeling goes away, then the peace is gone. Do you have anything to kind of touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so in one sense, peace is a feeling. we certainly all, at times in our lives, whether we're watching a gorgeous sunset or we are doing something we enjoy, from baking bread to delivering a gift to somebody, we all experience that sort of emotive sense of peace. And that's important. If we don't have those experiences of peace, we can't understand fully what that means for that peace to be replicated and manifest for social communities. But it certainly is also the case that there are other kinds of peace. And in peace literature, there's what we call negative peace and positive peace. And negative peace is peace, but it's not peace in the same way that positive peace is peace. So negative peace is bringing a war to an end. Does bringing a war to an end bring peace? Yes, it does. But it's just basically ending something that was bad. That's different than the kind of positive peace where people live sort of side by side. Let's say they're neighboring nations, and one of the nations decides to deliver to the other nation, 20 tons of corn or something like that, just because they decide to deliver it. That's what we call something more like positive peace, where there's just a generous reciprocity that's freely given, and it brokers healthier relationships. But again, it's distinct from negative peace, where negative peace is just the absence of war. So there's lots of different ways to talk about peace. There's just a couple of categories there that I gave at the end, and of course, distinguish feelings of peace from the kind of peaceful relationships that exist between various communities of different gender, race, ethnicities, ages, and obviously nationalities.
As an educator and pastor, how do you look at the chaos that's going on around the world currently, and how do you find peace personally?
Okay, there's two big questions there. Let's deal with the second one. How do I find peace personally? I try to sort of keep my eye on larger pictures within the historical record and remind myself that cultures of human persons, whether you're talking about Romans or Assyrians or Babylonians or indigenous people all over the world, have encountered episodes of chaos and war, and then they usually go back to periods of relative tranquility and peace by and large. Actually, quite frankly, if you study the history of human species, war is much more prevalent, as best we can tell from what we know, in the last several centuries, excuse me. So I try to remind myself that peace really is possible, genuinely. Peace among different nationalities and people from different regions of the world, peace genuinely is possible. So I try to remember that. I certainly also, for my own personal peace, I try to read good literature. I try to get outside and see the sun. I try to remember that trees grow and the world can be beautiful even when there's conflict in cities or in war zones. And so I try to remind myself that those things are possible. And of course, I also have religious inclinations and reading of scripture that orients me to being a person of peace. And then the last thing I'd say is, because it's important, is my individual relationships with certain people certainly bring me peace. So try to remind myself history, try to get out in nature and know the world, religious texts and scripture in my context, and then personal relationships, both romantic and friendship, bring me peace. The second question you asked, which actually was your first question, I've reversed them, is something about how do we bring peace, or how do I understand peace in the larger conflicts that are going on in the world today? And if you want to rephrase the question, you can, but if that's it, man, it is really, really difficult. I saw a poster recently, a banner, and it was one of these thousands of things that we see on the internet every day. And it was an elderly gentleman standing with your sort of stereotypical cardboard protester sign. And his sign said something like this. It said, I apologize to the children of 2020 that we didn't fix this stuff in my generation.
Wow.
Something like that. So this elderly gentleman with this sign. And I thought, that resonated with me so powerfully, in the sense that every generation has to figure out how they are going to live peaceably one with another. There certainly, and without question, are issues of what scholars would call historical trauma or historical grief. That is the trauma of people that have been dislocated. So indigenous persons in the Americas, for example, certainly the African-American slave trade, and not only just African-American, but African slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean. And those things of historical trauma are vast and huge issues. But at the same time, and so that's an issue we have to talk about, but at the same time, persons living in our world today, so in the 2020s, we have to say there are traumas that we are creating in the last 2 years and 5 years and 10 years that we have to own and take responsibility for right now. And we've got to solve unique problems that didn't exist 20 years ago, while we also work to reconcile the problems that existed 40 and 120 years ago. So until we get better at our habits of living peaceably one with another, until we get better at our habits of treating people with equality and justice and kindness and compassion, until we get better at recognizing that there are periods in everyone's life where they need a hand up and a hand out. There are periods in everyone's life when they need that. And so when we help people in those ways, then we can break down the tensions that lead to new crises, new conflict that build on old crises and old conflict. So again, there's so much involved in how to think about living at peace in our world today, because there is so much baggage of hurt, conflict, and trouble in the world. But the only way we're going to solve those problems is if we look them square in the eye and start working at them. I feel like I'm talking a lot on your podcast here, but let me say, you know, I think back to things like the famous speech when John F. Kennedy said, we're going to send a man to the moon.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
You know, at the time, that was an audacious, impractical, and one might even say at the time, given the technology they had, it was an impossible goal. And yet, the people who took hold of that vision, they made it happen within a few years, quite frankly. And I just wish we would do the same thing with our peacemaking. If we said, in this century, we're going to solve the problem of racism. In this century, we're going to own up to the failures we've had as individuals and as cultural communities and national identities to ostracize and treat people unfairly. We could live in a different world, a more peaceable, loving world 10 years from now. I absolutely believe it's possible.
I do too. I do too. That's great. You know, talking about the current stuff that we're going through, earlier you mentioned that one thing that you do is kind of look back at history and to reflect on that, you know, they made it through this, we can do it too. Recently, I was introduced to the story of Corrie Ten Boom, and I actually really, truly didn't know who she was until very recently. And then I just kind of started learning more and more about her. And I was just like, wow, that's really incredible. Well, first of all, for the people that are not familiar with Corrie Ten Boom, she lived from 1892 to 1983. And in 1922, she became the first woman licensed as a watchmaker in Holland. She lived in a shop called Casper's Watch Shop. In 1940, Nazification of the Dutch people began. She built a hidden wall in her bedroom, and in this wall, it also included ventilation. She created living procedures and timed drills with alarms to help hide and protect the Jews from the Nazi arrest. Corrie helped the Jews escaped the Nazi Holocaust during World War II and was later put into a concentration camp herself for her assistance in helping save nearly 800 people. I haven't gotten the chance to read her book. She wrote the book of The Hiding Place. Do you have any insight about Corrie Boom's story and how it kind of pertains to peace today?
Yeah. So thanks so much for asking that great question about The Hiding Place and Corrie Ten Boom. Let me share a couple of things. First of all, about Corrie Ten Boom, of course, she's a great model of a person who acted to be a peacemaker and to save people's lives. And without question, she did that. She also put her own life at risk in that process. So it's a great story about what she did. I also happen to teach with my intersection of Jewish and Christian studies and historical issues. I happen to teach on the Holocaust, or what scholars would sometimes call the Shoah, Holocaust studies, Shoah studies. And one thing that often happens when I teach classes on that experience of dislocation, disruption, fracture, brokenness, and genocide that took place between 1933 and 1945 for the Jews is a lot of people will start the class and they'll say things like, well, yeah, Hitler just kept killing those Jews. And that's usually the way the language is framed, almost exclusively Hitler. And I tell students regularly, Hitler didn't kill the Jews. Tens of thousands of people who turned over Jews killed the Jews. Tens of thousands of people who plundered Jewish homes killed the Jews. Tens of thousands of people who built the machinery the trains and the concentration camps and the ghettos and the walls that led to the destruction of Jews killed Jews. In other words, my point is, when people think about the Holocaust, and I'll come back to Corrie Ten Boom in a minute, but when they think about the Holocaust, it's always this sort of like, well, there was one guy or there was a couple of guys at the top, and it's almost always guys, and they did this. And I try to help people recognize, no, actually what creates situations like the genocide of the Jews and the Roma and the Gypsies and the gays and lesbians and political prisoners and the Holocaust, what creates that situation is the failure of social communities to care for everyone in their midst. So Corrie Ten Boom is a great example of an individual who worked to save people's lives, of an individual who made good choices, of an individual who in that hiding place found a way to sort of make peace possible in a horrific situation, at least for a few. The problem is there's not enough people that do that regularly so that you don't need a hiding place that Corrie Ten Boom establishes. In other words, what I would advocate for is that while the story itself of Corrie Ten Boom is a great story, it points to the miserable failure of the social communities such that there weren't so many Corrie Ten Booms that the Holocaust itself never became a reality. So yeah, there's certainly more I could say, but it's a great story. I advocate for the story and reading it, but I also would advocate yet more that we want to hold someone like Corrie Ten Boom up as she'd be a righteous among the Gentiles, would be the language that the Jewish nation and modern state of Israel would refer to her as. And she is a person who saved lives. But we also have to recognize that there are so many who didn't save lives. And we really have to, again, go back to our training. We have to train people to be more like Corrie Ten Boom, more people to be more like Corrie Ten Boom in the world.
I totally agree. I watched the movie about it, and it was quite interesting. I felt like, why didn't I learn about her in school?
I'll share something else too. So this is a summary I use regularly in this class that I teach. So my anti-Semitism and the Holocaust course that I teach as a university course, I advocate and do peacemaking work all through it because of several issues that are part of that course. And so there's a famous quote from a person who experienced the Holocaust. Yehudi Bauer is his name. And he was asked one time, what moral lessons should we learn from the Holocaust? And he said, do not be a perpetrator, that someone who actively hurt someone. Do not be a bystander. Obviously, don't let this happen in front of you. And do not be a victim. So don't allow these things to happen to you personally. So they famously said, do not be a perpetrator, do not be a victim, do not be a bystander. And I tell students, and obviously I'm telling you and your audience here today, that's a great statement, but I think we need to do more. So I've added sort of the backside of it, because his is sort of the negative. Do not, do not, do not. And I say, kind of in line with what I've shared here already as part of the podcast, we need to train to do other things. So I say, not only do we not need to be perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, but we need to be rescuers. Mm-hmm. We need to be upstanders, people who stand up for other people. That's an actual vocabulary word. Some people, in fact, I found people don't even know that's a vocabulary word. I'm like, yeah, don't just be a bystander, be an upstander, stand up for something. So we need to be rescuers, we need to be upstanders, and we need to be peacemakers. And the world isn't going to begin to experience peace for our lives and for our social communities until we act in ways where we do intentionally things that advocate for and bring about peaceable, charitable, kind, just communities.
Yeah, that's true. Peace, it doesn't happen on accident.
Correct.
Speaking of quotes, I actually found 3 quotes by Corrie Ten Boom that really stood out to me. So I'm just going to read those really quick.
Yeah.
Worry does not empty tomorrow of its sorrow. It empties today of its strength. I love that.
That's great.
Never be afraid to trust an unknown future with a known God. Yeah. This one really stood out to me because it's like, as I was reading it, I thought, oh my gosh, that like really just kind of clicks, and it gives you this good visual. When a train goes through a tunnel and it gets dark, you don't throw away the ticket and jump off of the train. You sit still and trust the engineer.
Yeah, that's
man, that's so...
That's great.
really good. I think there's a lot of people that whenever a stormy season happens, that they feel like kind of jumping off the train, so to speak. Whenever they feel that peace going away, they kind of feel like, oh, well, then it's impossible to obtain peace. One thing that really stood out to me about that quote was just the fact of who she is as a person. She could have really turned out to be a really bitter woman, but instead of focusing on all of the negatives, she shifted her focus. And I think that kind of goes back into what you were saying earlier about how you have to train yourself. And I think that even goes into like our perspectives, and like we have to train habits in the way that we think, in the way that we perceive things, in the way that we look at things, or the way that we maybe judge things. Like maybe we need to shift this. And it's obvious that she's done that brilliantly.
Let me pick up on that too, and not picking at a statement you just made, but just using it as a framework to re-say something. You said something like, we need to train ourselves, or I need to train myself. Absolutely. But I also think we have to be trained, and we need coaches or mentors to help us. So we know that the gold medal winning athletes who are the best at their field in the Olympics have coaches. And the reason they have coaches is because if a javelin thrower, if his or her arm is out to the side, they need someone to tell them, no, tuck in your elbow, or whatever it is. The person who's doing the high jump needs someone to tell them, your hands are twisted this way or that way. So my point with that is, I agree with you. We've got to sort of train ourselves and train myself to be more of a peaceable, loving, caring, kind, equitable person. But we also have to have coaches and mentors. We have to have people who say, hey, when you were talking to your coworker today, you weren't very nice to them. And you said this and this, and you could have said this and that, or you could have just not said anything and said, that's a great perspective. So in other words, we need other people in our lives to help us learn how to be more loving, kind, caring. I think at some level, all of us, not even just think at some level, I know at some level, all of us are prone to look out for our own self-interest. Mm-hmm. What's in it for me? How do I benefit from this? How am I going to be the winner, the recipient of cash, dollars, prizes, education, a new promotion as a result of this? And that's something just sort of innate to us as human creatures. But at the same time, then we have to find ways to recognize that our human creatureliness ties us up with humanity and other persons. And quite frankly, we wouldn't be able to live in the world if we didn't have other people that do other things. On the counter where I'm staying, there's a toaster. I love eating toast. I couldn't have toast if somebody didn't invent a toaster. I need someone to invent a toaster, right? I need other people. I need people who know how to get water to run through pipes so it makes it into the sink so I can brush my teeth and take a shower. We really need other people. And so we've got to recognize we train ourselves in peacemaking practices, but we need each other. We've got to rely on the wisdom, help, insight, and perspective that others offer us to be more peaceable.
I completely agree. That's good. That's great. I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, while you were talking, it made me think about what you mentioned before when you were talking about the Holocaust and your unique perspective on it. Of there needs to be more Corrie Ten Booms. There, it's a shame that it was just like her. It should have never happened. So it kind of made me think about that whenever you're talking about how we need everybody, and you need to be accountable to talk to someone. Hey, you weren't very nice. I know that's kind of simplifying it, but
true. That's exactly right. The other thing, again, so when I say that's exactly right, in the horrific situations where someone shows up at their place of work and they bring a firearm and they shoot coworkers, that happens because over weeks, that person was mistreated, bullied, or they might have had something outside the workplace. But another way that scholars in the field of peace studies talk about this is microaggressions and macroaggressions. And again, it's pretty obvious. Micro is the small individual bits, and macro is the big bits. But you take a cup. You take a cup like this, and you can put in the 12 ounces to fill it up, and it does not overflow. But as soon as you pour in that last drop to make it overflow. Of course, it's not going to empty out, but more than a drop will empty out because that surface tension breaks on the top of the science of it breaks and you lose a bunch. And my point with that is that the helping people in their workplace just learn to be kind in how everybody uses the office refrigerator, or everybody takes a part in cleaning up the office microwave. Those little things actually add up, and they add up to peaceable communities. They really do. So it really is the little things that become the tangible ways that we work out from ourselves to others into the world to expand the possibilities for peace.
I think that it's easier for someone to just say, oh, well, I'm just in a negative working environment and everybody around me is awful and I can't do anything about it. But I think that mentality of kind of pointing fingers and victimizing yourself, saying, well, they always mistreat me, they always do this, or they, I think that the thing that we can do is look at ourselves first.
Sure.
Like, okay, for example, I'll use marriage as an example.
Sure.
Like cleaning the dishes. You can clean the dishes, or you can think, okay, well, I don't want to clean the dishes, right? Why doesn't my husband clean the dishes? Or no, he cleans the dishes. Okay, we both clean the dishes. I'm just using an example.
Sure.
But so you might look at it like that, kind of build up this like resentment. You build up all of these thoughts of, well, they don't respect me, or this person doesn't do this and this person doesn't do that and that. But really, if you flip it back and then you clean the areas or whatever in love, despite what you're seeing, one, I think you're sowing spiritual seed for healing in your relationship. And then two, I think it's also like releasing the issue, the care to God, and then allowing God to deal with the other person's heart. Because like you can't control what one person does.
Well, but let me talk about the sort of general notion of doing the dishes. It's possible for a marital couple that one of them does the dishes every single night and the other one never touches them. And they can be perfectly happy with that. Yeah. Now, typically what's going to happen in that kind of relationship is one of them does the dishes every night because the other one always cleans the toilet or takes the trash out, whatever it is. In other words, there generally has to be kind of a reciprocity. But here's the interesting thing about doing the dishes is it doesn't really matter what the agreement between these two parties is, as long as they're happy with it. What becomes a problem is when someone washes the dishes every day and then 2 months later, 8 months later, because of lots of other issues, yells at their spouse and says, I'm the only one who ever cleans the dishes and you've never helped. And the other spouse stands back and says, I'm sorry, I didn't know you wanted help. Yeah. Or maybe I'm sorry, when I tried to help 6 months ago, you told me you would do it yourself and I just thought you meant you liked doing it. Or I'm sorry, when I tried to help you in the past, I didn't do it good enough and so I didn't feel like I was able to do it. In other words, my point is, sometimes the root issue is the communication over it. If a spouse doesn't like doing the dishes all the time, then it's contingent on them to communicate. Communication. Mm-hmm. And clarity in communication is so frequently at the heart of what become, again, small complications and conflicts that then evolve and grow into larger conflicts and greater disputes.
I agree. You can look at it from like a marriage standpoint, like a marriage relationship, but it's the same thing for every other area. It's relationships are relationships.
Yeah.
Communication.
Let me throw in kind of a funny comment. I hope to intend to be funny on the marital spousal conflict and whatever. I certainly am not a perfect, peaceable, loving person in all situations. But in some of the conflict that I've had on occasion in the past with my spouse, there might have been an occasion where she was upset about something and I wasn't, or I wasn't as engaged in the particular topic as much. And I would try to say to her, and this was early in our relationship, and she largely embraced what I'm going to share with you here, and it's been great for us. But she would be mad about something and be riled up about it, and I'd be like, babe, let's talk about this in the morning. And but we've got to solve this problem and whatever. And I'd look at my watch and I'm like, babe, it's 11 o'clock. I have had a long day. And let's just deal with this in the morning. And on more than one occasion, early in my marriage, my wife said to me, But there's a scripture, there's a scripture, a Bible reference, a scripture that says, do not let the sun go down on you when you're angry. We've got to solve this. So there's a passage in Ephesians that says such a thing. And I looked at my wife and I said, I'm not angry. So I can go to bed. I'm like, you're angry. And I tried to help her see the scripture doesn't say you have to solve the problem tonight. Because there are some couples that quite literally argue, and they even use that scripture, Christian couples. We have to solve this tonight. And quite frankly, when people are irritable, there's an acronym, HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. If you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, it's unlikely you're going to solve problems well. So people are late at night. They've had a long day. Some of them are angry. They're tired. They may be hungry because the meal was separate, and they're trying to solve a conflict. And you can't solve a conflict. So again, my point, as I say too much here, is I finally got my wife to agree. Babe, I'm not saying we can't talk about this tomorrow. I'm not saying I don't care about this. I'm saying let's just go to sleep, and we'll talk about it, and we'll solve it tomorrow after we've had a good night's sleep. And quite frankly, what happens is, much of the time you wake up in the morning and it's not even an issue anymore because you were arguing about something silly and you were hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. But really what happens is you wake up and you have a fresh mind to deal with it. So if I could give a piece of marital advice, I do not think couples should go to bed angry. I don't think that, but I also think couples should have the wherewithal to be able to say to each other, this is a more complex problem than we can solve tonight. What time tomorrow are we going to talk about this so we can solve it? Or let's go to dinner this week and let's talk about it together. And quite frankly, if you're at a meal together and you talk about the exact same issue, you might actually be able to resolve it. So a little bit of sort of marital advice with that verse of scripture that I think sometimes gets misappropriated.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's good to talk about.
And let me note too, I'm not saying go to bed and forget it and act like nothing's the problem. If there's conflict, there's something that's at the root of it that the couples need to reconcile and come to understand and communicate about. But sometimes you just say, in the morning before we leave for work, or tomorrow after work before we do anything else, this is what we're going to talk about.
I think it's important to make time, like schedule out time, even if it's like, later this week, we're going to talk about this issue. You can use that same principle even at work, at school, So I think that's really good information for anybody to have, whether they're married or not.
You're absolutely right. In work situations, someone can say to someone else, hey, Steve, I recognize that right now you're really upset about mechanic, tools, job, refrigerator, whatever it is. We're not going to be able to solve that right now because before 5 o'clock, we've got to XYZ, whatever the company's got to do. What day this week can we come address this conflict? But can we do it not now so we can finish this job today? And if coworkers, supervisors, managers then come back 2 days later and talk with employees about that, one, the steam is generally blown off, but people would then feel like they're treated respectfully. They feel like they can communicate well. Those problems can be solved. And then the next time people go out on whatever that job is, the expectations will be better and people really will get along better. So again, it's opening up pathways for communication.
Whenever I look back at some of my past job roles at different companies, the biggest issues that I've seen that I've had personally is whenever I don't communicate well, sure, or vice versa. And so I think it's a little thing, like there's the buzzwords of communication, but it's a real thing. Yeah. You have to take time and make time for it.
I'll give credit here to a Zen Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, and I specifically know this. There's some things I go back to in my life. He specifically talks on this subject in a audio interview that was done on the On Being podcast and radio show with Krista Tippett. And to make a long story short, Thich Nhat Hanh in that episode talks about how there's conflict in the world and between people because of our misperception, miscommunication, and misplaced anger. And I try to remember those three categories all the time when I'm in a situation that is potentially volatile or with conflict, or even casually or absolutely. I try to say to myself, what am I not perceiving here? What is it about this person's anger that I genuinely do not understand? Because if you can get back behind the anger and then you find out this person feels like they're taken advantage of at work. And that's why they're yelling about the microwave, right? But if you get back behind it, or if you communicate about it, or if you understand that they're really not angry about Bob parking, they're angry that their wife treated them poorly this morning, and they can't get mad at their wife because of X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. And so they're placing it somewhere else. Anyway, those three things from Thich Nhat Hanh, I remember those on a frequent basis. Miscommunication, misperception, and misplaced anger. We should ask ourselves those questions when we're in a conflicted moment, especially when someone else or some other group is conflicted, and say, why is this person so upset? What am I misperceiving? What am I not understanding in communication? And is there some other context of anger that's actually rising in this other setting?
That's good. That is truth.
Yeah.
Kind of shifting the topic a little bit, going back to Corrie Ten Boom, I want to read a scripture really quick. So Psalms 32:7 says that you are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. So that scripture really stood out to me, especially with her book, The Hiding Place. One thing that really kind of highlighted to me was visualizing the fact that when she built the hidden room, like she had to build it. It wasn't there. The room wasn't, it didn't exist. She had to take action. She had to buy the stone, the everything. She had to plan it to where they could fit in it and breathe while they're hiding. So it's just that physical aspect of her protecting these Jews, hiding them in this hidden place of protection where they can breathe. It kind of makes me think about peace and how, in the midst of the storm, like sometimes we just have to like cast our cares to God and just like breathe. Like sometimes we can't do anything, but we have to breathe. But that scripture, Psalms 32:7, specifically whenever it mentions that you are my hiding place, you will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. Do you think that there's a correlation with the scripture?
So several things. Obviously, most people live in an apartment or a condo or a house. So we can't really appreciate living out of doors all of the time. And that scripture, of course, comes from ancient Israelites and from David, that we know as King David. But those come from his shepherding experiences, where he literally is guiding sheep through valleys and ravines and up and down slopes. And so we started the podcast talking about me being in Oregon and rain. And, I would invite you or anybody listening to think about being out in a rainstorm. And in just drizzling rain, it's just not fun. You're cold and you're wet. And then add to a not fun rainstorm, some thunder and lightning, where it's like, wow, there's a lot of energy going on. And what it means then for you to be in a rainstorm and to get to someplace safe. So of course we go into our homes, get in your car kind of thing. But man, what must that have felt like for ancient people and even people in the world today to be stuck in a storm and to quite literally find a cave to get into? I mean, it literally in that moment becomes a total place of refuge. They can take off the wet clothes, build a fire, get warm, get out of the rain itself, bring in their flocks as the case may be. And so that really, it so genuinely is a place of safety and comfort and a hiding place and a protective place. And then, of course, that's what scripture teaches about how David celebrates who God is, that God is that shelter from the storm. God is that the being, the power and the presence that helps people endure the storms of life. And of course, there's so much biblical and spiritual theological reflection there. But yeah, I think that's true of what Corrie Ten Boom was trying to provide. And I think it can be true in our lives, that we often feel people experience storms, trauma, difficulty. And we each, in our own lives and in our communities, need to find shelters and places that get us out of life's miserable situations and life storms.
I love that. And giving that visual reference of David in the cave,
Sure.
that reminds me of that season, he was anointed and then nothing happened for like, what was it, 13?
Right. Before he finally becomes king and is inaugurated. Sure.
And so I think it could have been really, for him, during that season, it looked like hopeless.
Yeah.
Possible. And then the impossible happened.
Yeah.
There was hope behind that storm that lasted what seemed to be forever.
Actually, in those days of David's life that narrated to us in 1 Samuel and in the first part of 2 Samuel, it's actually pretty good testimony of David as a peacemaker. Now, David's a pretty complex character, and David makes some bad choices. But with Saul, David consistently refuses to sort of put Saul down or kill Saul or even really speak ill of Saul. In fact, when Saul and his son Jonathan die, in the first chapter of 2 Samuel, David sings a song. It's called the Song of the Bow. He sings that song over Jonathan and Saul, and he weeps that Saul and Jonathan had been killed. So I highlight those things to say that in some ways, in those narratives with David, David is a pretty good living testimony to someone who doesn't try to take power for himself and tries to really sort of trust the future to God's hands and trust that the situation will resolve itself, and he doesn't need to, the language of scripture says he doesn't need to kill the Lord's anointed. But he trusts that he doesn't need to do that God is working out in God's own time, God's own plan.
So kind of looking at the characteristic of David and as an example of a peacemaker, what would you say to the people that are listening to this podcast that we can take away from that and how we can use it in our daily lives?
Absolutely. So first of all, let me note, I'm also a teacher of scripture, so I need to note that David is a complex character. And like me and like you and like all of us, he's imperfect. But in these episodes in David's life, in his relationship with Saul, several things specific to David. David regularly got out his harp, played music, and sang songs. We know that both from the book of Psalms and from what we read in 1 Samuel. And I think that would be a testimony to some of us that sometimes we need to check out from the complex situation and do something that soothes us. For many of us, that may actually be music, playing music or doing music. It may also be getting out of doors and doing things. But I think the testimony of David is that he went to something that he was good at, that had a artistic talent that made him feel better. So I think there's that. Doing something that you feel good about, maybe artistically or with your hands. Second of all, for David, it was a way for him to commune with or reorient his relationship with God. And so certainly for believers, to find peace in their lives, that is for people who orient themselves with a theological vision of there being a God and God's presence in our world, then connecting with who God is. And that can obviously be prayer, reading of scripture, and worship and other things. The third thing that I would highlight about David is that David intentionally removed himself from situations where he might have been prone to cause harm. So when Saul was trying to get David, David was actually fleeing away from Saul. There's almost kind of a cat and mouse game there narrated at the end of 1 Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel. There's two great episodes in 1 Samuel 24 and 1 Samuel 26 where David decisively doesn't kill Saul when he had opportunity. And I would say then the third thing I would say is removing ourselves from situations that cause us distress, grief, pain, sorrow, as much as is possible can help bring us peace in the world. So I say as much as is possible. Clearly, if someone works an 8 to 5 job and they have to be in their place of work all day long, and that causes them distress and doesn't cause them to be peaceable, that person probably can't leave their job. Now, maybe somebody should quit that job, but maybe you can't. But maybe on every lunch break, people say, because this job causes me so much stress, I'm going to physically leave the building for lunch every day, and I'm going to go do something else. So again, the three things I'd say that I think David would serve as a model is David did something artistic or talented or something he was gifted in. David oriented himself to who God was and his relationship with God. And David physically removed himself from the distressing agent in his world. I think those things would help any of us when we found ourselves in situations of conflict.
I think that's great advice. You've traveled all over the globe. What would you say to all of us that you've learned about peace from different cultures?
That's a great question. I've been really fortunate to have opportunity to travel in the world. There's a lot of things I'd say we should learn about peace. First of all, I'd say that humans are humans everywhere you travel. We all need basic food, water, shelter. We all enjoy certain kinds of foods. Obviously, different cultures have different foods. They might suit their palate, or given the region where they're at, they have access to different foods. But we're all human. And we all need to lay our head down somewhere and get a good night's sleep. And we all want to celebrate the sort of rites of passage in most cultures, and some of it are unique, but marriages and births and grieve in our losses. Man, the first thing I'd share is It doesn't matter the level of melanina in your skin that makes you a different person. We are all humans together. And yeah, that'd be the first thing I'd say. Second thing I'd say is with respect to that and that humanness that we all embrace and we all are, not only do we all need food, shelter, a place to lay down our head, and really basic sustaining elements of life, but we all generally hope for the same things. I think anybody and everybody who's a parent, even quite frankly, even abusive parents, they want for their children to have a better world. They want for their children to have a little more food, a little more resources. They want for their children to live in a world where there's opportunities for employment and working in an environment that isn't deathly, some sort of mine or something like that, that has no OSHA standards of protection. Everybody wants a better future for themselves and their children. And I think if we could understand those basic elements that we all really want, and if we could see people across national boundaries instead of being different and being more like us, and we all really want to work for a better world for all of our children, and if we can embrace the fact that in the same way I want my children to have a better future, I really also want this Malaysian woman, her children to have a better future. I want this Filipino man for his grandchildren to have a better future. I want a Senegalese tribal person for their family and their tribe, for their children to have not be subject to malaria or whatever other kinds of things. If we really could look at the world in a framework within which we'd see our common humanity and our hope for a better future for the world of our children, then I think we could do so much better. Now, having said that, I'll also say experiencing other cultures really does give you the opportunity to try other foods, to be confused, to be lost. You get in other places and you realize you don't know your way around and you can't ask somebody for help because they all speak Thai and you don't speak that language when you're in Bangkok or whatever. Those things also remind you of the kind of the need that we have to rely on one another. So there's so many things about being in another culture, in another place, among people who speak a different language.
It puts you in a vulnerable state.
Absolutely, and you realize you really need the generosity of strangers to help you get through. Which, there's so many replications on that story, but of course, one of the most famous stories in the New Testament is the story of Jesus with what we call the story of the Good Samaritan, and it's really a story about neighborliness, right? So the person who was beat up and put by the side of the road needed someone to come and care for him, regardless of whatever his race, ethnic, gender identity was. He was nearly beaten to death, and he simply needed someone to care for him.
What do you do on a daily basis to bring yourself a sense of peace?
That's kind of funny you say that, because I would say to you, I'm actually not a very good person that has daily practices of peace. I live my life a little too frantically. Most of my days are quite different from the day before. I certainly have some patterns to them. But I do think there are some things that can bring us peace. I do think a more scheduled routine, which I actually don't live out very well, but a more scheduled routine builds in a kind of peacefulness one with another. I do think in our primary relationships, and by primary I mean really whoever you live with. That can be with your parents, if you live with your parents, your grandparents, can be with your romantic partners, your children, and then maybe if you don't actually have a roommate or live with someone, the people you live with based on where you shop and buy coffee or buy your bread or coworkers. I think in our primary relationships, we need to have routine conversations that are peaceable and participatory and reciprocal. So those would be just the two things I would say. There's certainly lots of other things. I think being out of doors on a regular basis and being out in nature helps us. There's science that demonstrates that's true. I think eating healthy diets, as I drink my poison of choice, I think eating healthy diets contributes to that. In fact, there's quite a bit of developing science that are what we call our gut biome, big fancy word, biome, our gut biome, that is the stuff in our stomach and our intestines and our kidneys and that converts our food into energy. There's quite a bit of evidence developing that what's in our gut biome contributes to our depression and the way we feel in the world. So back to your question, what do? I try to have some schedule in my life. I try to live in important ways in my primary relationships, but I think getting outdoors is important on a regular basis. I think the way we eat, I absolutely think sleep is so critical to how we feel in the world and how we approach the world. And I think for most people, having something that sort of grounds or roots them. For some people, that might be yoga or mindfulness exercises, all of which is great. Obviously, for different people, the believing communities, it would be reading scripture or praying or worshiping, and certainly then in my context. So we started our conversation talking about habits and relearning practices in certain ways. There's a particularly powerful story, we've already narrated it, sometimes known as the parable of the Good Samaritan or the neighbor. And I point out to people that in that story, it's not just about thinking well of other people. It's not just about wishing other people well. It's about tangibly doing something in the world. So again, I started out, and we started in the podcast mentioning habits and training in certain kinds of ways. And I do think Christians sometimes fail to bring about a peaceable world because they sort of pray for a peaceable world and don't do something. And I'm not saying that just praying is insignificant, but I'm saying that Scripture also calls us to take action. And with that in mind, the story of the parable, as we know it, the parable of the Good Samaritan, is so powerful because it ends with Jesus making the announcement or the pronouncement or the appeal or the request, however you want to see it. Jesus says, go and do likewise. So the parable has this powerful ending to it, where it's not just where Jesus gets his audience to think about the parable of the Good Samaritan as a story, but Jesus invites them to tangibly, with their lives, do something about it. So with that in mind, the story that Jesus narrates goes something like this. A teacher came to Jesus one day, a teacher in the law, and asked Jesus a question. Teacher, which of the commandments is the greatest? And Jesus replied back to him, you know the commandments. What do you find written there? The teacher in the law said, well, there's two great commandments. You shall love the Lord your God as yourself, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus replies back to that man, as narrated in Luke's gospel, do this, and you shall live. But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asks Jesus a further question, and who then is my neighbor? And in reply, Jesus says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and there fell among thieves, who robbed him, beat him, stole his possessions, and left him naked and half dead at the side of the road. Along that road that same day, a Pharisee came, and when he came to the place at which the man was, he passed by on the other side. And so too a Levite came down that road, and when he came to the place at which the man was and saw the man, he passed by on the other side. And on that same day, a Samaritan came down the road, and when he came to the place at which the man was and he saw him, he ran to him, he bandaged his wounds, he poured oil and wine into his injury, he lifted that man onto his own donkey and took him to Jericho with him, and there cared for him. When he woke up the next day, he went to the innkeeper and said, here is the equivalent of 2 days' wages. Take care of him, and when I return, I will repay whatever more you spend. Jesus turned and looked at the lawyer who had asked him the question, who is my neighbor? And Jesus asked the question back to that lawyer and said, which one of these showed kindness to the one in need? And Jesus said, the one who showed compassion. And Jesus ends his parable speaking both to that man and to his audience, and I think to us. And he says to all of us who want a more peaceable, loving, kind world, go and do the same. And that's my hope for our world, that we will go and do the same, be peaceful, kind, loving people, picking people up when they're down and helping them and helping our communities and helping our world bring about God's shalom, wholeness, wellness for the world, so that the world becomes the good place as God originally created it to be.
You've been listening to Caffeinated Inspiration, brought to you by Studiobeanhead. Now, I just want to thank you guys for listening to this podcast. I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to just spend this time with me. And I hope and pray that you have a blessed day and that you've enjoyed this time with me over a nice cup of coffee or whatever your beverage of choice is. I appreciate you. I really do.